Good morning, guys, and welcome to this new lecture. Today we are going to talk about John Dewey's pedagogical activism and thus the revolution that will implement this very great philosopher, psychologist, and especially in our case pedagogue with regard to the very school in the late 19th and early 20th century, initiating a real avant-garde revolution. Meanwhile, doing an analysis of schooling and how it was going in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a little bit all over the world we were seeing real changes, so much so that both in Europe and in America, academics were beginning to wonder whether schooling was still responding to the changes that there had been from a societal point of view, and therefore the social changes, but also to all the needs of the productive transformations that the world was undergoing at that time. And so the question was basically whether we should focus on a different training, on a more modern training, a training that was better suited to meet these new needs of both young people and society. A lot of the proposals of the period were about boarding schools, which were secondary school boarding schools where kids were housed all week and then maybe on the weekend they would go home. Why was this? Because these schools were not in all places in Italy, but very often they were dislocated from where the family members who sent their boys to study in these boarding schools lived. So there was really a need to have them leave for the whole week and then see them again only on weekends or holidays. The boys were housed within these boarding schools where they studied and could sleep and eat. Within these boarding schools, we see the first scholastic revolution in that up until the late 19th century and again in the early 20th century, schooling was all about a religious and moral style where lectures were given face to face and where teachers tended, as in front of military men, to lecture and give lots of notions that the boy made his own, and then he became a kind of photocopy of what the teacher was. That is, notions upon notions without being able to rework these notions, without being able to express his own ideas and make up his own mind. So the strict discipline of these religious schools and these military schools is being replaced by a more democratic discipline where the confrontation of ideas is encouraged, where young people can also express what their own aptitudes and inclinations are, and at the same time put into practice activities where they are precisely protagonists. On the other hand, as far as real revolutions were concerned, they were made within the elementary schools as well, and here we call into play precisely our protagonist, and that is John Dewey. In fact, John Dewey founded an elementary school at the pedagogical department of the University of Chicago, a school that then gave way to a series of others that took their example precisely from Dewey and then slowly spread all over the world because they were taken as an example in France, also in Italy with Montessori and many other pedagogists of the time such as De Crowley, Claparedi and so on. Even though these schools were called avant-garde schools, they still remained for many and many years an elitist phenomenon. Why is this? Because effectively only those who could afford to send their children to school because they were part of a family perhaps quite wealthy and therefore with the possibilities of getting their children educated then sent their children to these schools. Unfortunately, at the time there was still the greatest scourge to be defeated, which was precisely that of child illiteracy. This was for several reasons. The first was precisely a lack of money. The second was also the fact that precisely because of economic necessity, many of these children were being exploited in the world of work from a very young age and therefore did not have the opportunity even to go to school to have a minimum of their own primary literacy. However, the breaking point becomes fundamental and definitive because from now on schooling changes completely. If before it was seen a bit like a military institution where everybody went to school to learn notions upon notions upon notions without reworking this information to create minds that were always the same, now the very ideology of school changes, and through the Dewey we go from a kind of passive lessons that saw the pupils undergoing these lectures to a total transformation in that the pupils become the real protagonists of the whole situation. They become active. So much so that this avant-garde strand is called precisely Dewey's pedagogical activism. In what does it consist? It consists precisely in seeing the pupil as the protagonist of the lesson, insofar as the teacher will not stand there doing theory, reading in books or giving lessons from books, but will make the children experience certain situations. In fact, Dewey, within this Chicago school, creates real pedagogical laboratories where the children are activated to learn how to do so many things. So hands-on workshops that revolve, for example, example, around workshop work, textile work, or kitchen work. In this school, kids ranging from 4 to 13 years old participate, and their job is just to continuously do workshops where they will do lots of experiments. Certainly compared to before, there is more attention to what are the pupil's propensities, qualities, and aptitudes, because somehow the pupil is forced to deploy strategies to find solutions to problems that the teacher will present to them. An example that comes to mind is just that of the egg. That is, through experiments, through labs, the pupils learn to do two things, meanwhile to cook. For this process, also the physical change that takes place in the egg itself, so much so that they learn the moment the egg then boils that it goes from a liquid state to a solid state. So in addition to having learned to drop it in the kitchen, so learning how to cook an egg, they will also learn what is the chemical physical process of transformation of the matter itself. In the practical act, what changes? It changes the fact that there is active pupil participation. Pupils must collaborate and cooperate with each other to find solutions to problems that the teacher will bring before them. The teacher will not teach any kind of theory, but from practice then theory will be derived. So the basis of Dewey's thinking is precisely experience, the active experience of each individual pupil. This is because human experience for Dewey is primarily an active thing before it is a cognitive thing. And then this hands-on activity is useful because it makes us know things. That is, through the relationship between the experiment we do and what we deduce from it, we are also then able to know things. So everything will be known through experience. Now let us see in order what are then the steps that comprise this thought. The first thing then that the teacher has to do is precisely to pose a problem that then becomes precisely for the pupil a discomfort, that is a reason for which to ask himself questions and techno-industry in some way to find answers. The second step will be that of observation, so the pupil will have to observe all the variables and everything available to try to put them together and find a solution to the reported problem. Once all the variables have been observed, the student will move on to the third step, which is to try to formulate a hypothesis for the solution of the problem. Then he will have to test whether indeed his hypothesis was true or not. And the fifth point is, if the hypothesis is somehow verified with certain data that are repeated and are always the same, then fine, you have found a solution to the problem. Otherwise, you will have to start the whole process all over again. And let's say that this procedure is very reminiscent of the scientific method, the one on which all sciences are then based. It is precisely made up of an observation of data, a formulation of a hypothesis, an empirical and therefore reality-based verification of the hypothesis itself, until, if these data are verified, the formulation of a theory or a thesis. Otherwise, we will have to start the procedure all over again, observing the data again and formulating a new hypothesis. Children are not left to their own devices, however, and in fact the teacher will have to establish criteria for evaluating experiences that may be positive, and distinguish them from those that will be negative. And this can only be established on the basis of two criteria. The first is the principle of continuity, that is, start with small experiments, and the solution of these experiments will lay the foundation for subsequent problems. So go in steps, in stages. The second is the principle of interaction, according to which the individual will not work alone but will always work in interaction with the surrounding environment. So the two basic variables will be the individual but also the surrounding environment. Another fundamental point of Dewey's style of education is the concept of democracy. In fact, he cares so much about this concept because school, according to Dewey, has to be a bit of the basis of what will happen later on in the future. That is how the student will learn certain things and then has to be able to put them into practice in the working world. And so he tries to have the idea of democracy interjected right from the school desks. In fact, according to Dewey, there is an equal relationship between democracy and education, because if man has been so intelligent as to reach agreements in a democratic form, it is good for pupils to learn them right from school as within group work. Everyone will have his or her own task to perform and thus will have duties and rights within the group itself. The duty will be to carry out one's own task. The right will be to be part of a group, thus to be supported by the group, and then all together arrive at the common goal. So through the experience, Dewey teaches as well the concept of democracy, which then the boys, once they have made their own, will be able to re-spend outside of school and in the world of work. Well guys, I have finished my talk on Dewey for today. Study it well. If you have any questions or there is something you did not understand, you can also ask me questions below. I will say goodbye, thank you for your attention, and see you in the next video.